Okay, thanks very much indeed. I've listened all morning and enjoyed loads of comments, and I suppose I was thinking about this session being entitled Inclusion and what I've picked up from the morning. And so far I've picked up, reinforced to me, the notion of government action, because I think we've been fortunate in the development of the technologies that government has amazingly taken the lead and actually enabled resource to stimulate action at the grassroots. I think that's not true in every country, and I think we've been fortunate with that, and it's terribly important, and I say this now, that all of us in this room make sure that that continues to be the case. Because if it weren't the case, then all sorts of inequalities and lack of access would start to develop, just as we're on the cusp, it seems to me, of making huge advances so far as inclusion is concerned. So Neil's comments about home access, and you could see him deciding that he was going hell for leather to make sure it happened before there would be any chance of any brakes being put on it, seemed to me to be absolutely right. I suppose the other thing I picked up on from other sessions was David's point about internationalism and our realisation that at the moment there are loads of schools, secondary schools in particular, who are having a re-equipment, and uncommented upon is the redirection of some resources in a usable form to the developing country, and often not accompanied, and it could be, by international links between young people themselves to enable the next generation in the developing world to hold hands with the next generation in the developed world in solving some of our future problems. There is a movement in America called future problem solving, which is very strong in America, and I think is developing in this country, which involves young people in actually tackling some of the issues of the future together. I think that's another issue of a wider issue of access and inclusion that we ought to take seriously. And unspoken, and I had no idea, as a result of watching what I was doing this morning, I've come away thinking there's a neglect of females in terms of access to higher level qualifications in this territory, and that long term is going to build up an inequality that is extremely worrying. And I have to say that it seems to me that there may be something in terms of colour, black and white and different ethnic groups. I have no idea if there is, because so far I've not seen it explored in what we've discussed, but I've gone away prompted to think very hard about that in terms of promoting an inclusive agenda. So the first thing I wanted to do was to say, well, if we're after inclusion, and I'm not going to speak for very long, it seems to me that there are certain assumptions. These three, I think, are pretty important. That you start from the assumption that you're running a system that's trying to provide success for everyone, not depending on failure of some. And don't forget, that's a big departure for our schooling system. Tony Blair talked about success for the many, not the few, and I wrote to him and got into terrible trouble because I said, well, that's fine, but who are the ones you don't want to succeed? Because if we're after success for everyone, then I think the technologies have got all sorts of possibilities of enabling that to happen. But as light follows day, it seems to me that most of our views of intelligence in this room were formulated, and I bet you still in our discourse, our view of intelligence is a bit towards the general, inherited, and certainly it's in the territory of predictable. Whereas I'm sure that Howard Gardner's theories, which he's the first to say aren't sound, but nevertheless are an advance on where we are of multifaceted intelligence is terribly important to the first. I would argue, by the way, that the technologies enable us to act on that in a way that wouldn't have been possible before the technologies were there. And I shall come to that in a second. And finally, it seems to me that what one is trying to do all the time when kids are learning, and it's an interesting issue that every example we've had this morning implies that learning is enjoyable, and that is it the case, I think it is, that the technologies enable that learning to be internalized and energized by the learner, and is much less dependent on the teacher as a result of the technologies. I'm not saying that it isn't aided by the teacher, it is, but that if you asked, well, kids are in school for 90% of their time, in school for 15% of their time, and 85% of their time, of their waking time, they're in the community. I dare to say that more learning as a result of the technologies is happening in that 85% than used to be the case. And therefore, have we really thought about that? Children have become and enjoy learning as a result of the technologies in a way that I'm not absolutely sure that in that precious 15% of the time we've yet adjusted what we do in order to make that happen. Now, I want to argue, oh, and by the way, the ipsative is against your own previous best, which it seems to me the technologies absolutely work on, and formative, the best programs do, but it introduces normative and comparative, but it's done privately. And if you think about the very best teachers work on ipsative and formative assessment with kids and are very, very sensitive about when to introduce the normative and the comparative, because they know damn well introduce it at the wrong time and you shut learning down for the insecure, and you shut learning down for the person who's really making progress because they become complacent. So how that is introduced is tremendously important, and it seems to me that the technologies promote you thinking about those. So if you were going to try to be inclusive, it seems to me that those would be your three assumptions. And most of our discourse, I've got to say, fails on that second one. So I just make that point provocatively. Variable progress so far. I really enjoyed your presentation because of your focus on children who've got major barriers to their learning, and how nobody can doubt that the technologies have removed barriers to those kids' learning, and therefore to the possibility that they will lead a fulfilled and fulfilling life. You gave the example, you gave a Braille example. You could easily look at hearing impairment. You could look at physical communication. You could look at almost everything that is dependent on the technologies. So my view that as a tool, it's been fantastic. As a library, it's just unbelievable, isn't it? If you look at kids now who are cheerfully finding things out in a way they would never have bothered to find out if it was dependent on the old technologies. As communication, it seems to me in that respect, the communication is a revolution that the handheld device accelerates in a way that's quite extraordinary. I was reflecting, this would be the first occasion on which I wouldn't dare to stand up and say, by the way, would you mind if during the next 15 minutes you all switched off your mobile? I mean, it would have been a pointless waste of time, wouldn't it? Because you've got them on and you have been using them from time to time to do some surreptitious, off-piste learning while the session has been going on. I've been watching you do it, and absolutely fine that you should do so. But that does, doesn't it, revolutionise how we see learning. And finally, as computer-assisted teaching, learning and assessment. Well, in that territory, I'm hugely disappointed with the development of the technologies so far, particularly so far as assessment is concerned. And I'll come on to why that would be. But I am disappointed by that, and I'm disappointed by that in the context of the 15% that's in school rather than the 85% that's beyond school. Barriers to progress. Well, the first is me. I'm an aged leader, now no longer leading, you'll be delighted to know, pensioned off, and the world is safer in consequence. But you know, the aged leader issue has been a huge barrier to taking advantage of the tipping point of moving things on. Huge barrier to it. I don't know if you heard the story that when Mrs. Thatcher left office and she went to live at home, somebody had to tell her how to use the telephone because the technology had moved on. Now, if you actually think of leaders being insulated from the use and possibilities of the technologies, then it's a really fearful proposition in terms of making sure that access is there for everybody. Timely CPD, you see over on the right, I've got that issue of the unconscious. You know, we're all unconsciously incompetent about an issue. The next one down should be conscious incompetence. It isn't there, right? It's an error, right? There's a gap there. So you move, don't you? If somebody introduces technology within the learning environment to a group rather than an individual, it's probably true of the individual as well. I can think of the literacy R, the numeracy R. I can think of the introduction of a VLE, of you know, the interactive whiteboard, or the whole damn lot. You move. You were perfectly happy. This is back to the aged leader. You were perfectly happy, like your parents, perfectly happy, and then somebody comes along and makes you consciously incompetent, and you're an unhappy person immediately. And that's when you need the timely CPD. And colleagues, if we're after an inclusive agenda, that is pathetic in our system at the moment in terms of real coaching support for practitioners within the 15% of the school session to make sure that people get to conscious competence in the use of the technologies and the possibilities it's got for transforming their practice as teachers and learners. And then, of course, you move on to unconscious competence. The technologies move on so damn quickly that, unless you're very careful, you're right round on the whole thing again. And I think we're lurching into a period where that may happen really vividly and dangerously. If we have cuts in public expenditure, why did I say if? When we have cuts in public expenditure, the two things that people in this room should be begging for is some sort of stimulus to keeping up with the technologies, both in terms of purchasing power and CPD. Because the best thing to do is to enable people to dip down from unconscious competence to conscious competence. Leave CPD long and you've got to go through the whole bloody lot again and get into trouble. A third barrier to progress has been the autonomous, independent and competitive school in our schooling system. This isn't true of every schooling system. It is in the United Kingdom, and it looks like being given another flip. We need partnerships of schools, and they won't be developed by saying that that's a good way of saving money. Partnerships of schools, in my experience, accelerate the CPD that's necessary and accelerate the best use of the technologies. Within school, there are all sorts of organisational issues that get in the way of the use of the technologies. Somebody earlier was alluding to the notion of people sort of pathetically saying, switch all your, trying to keep, it was you know, keep the mobiles well away. You gave loads of illustrations in your introduction of intra-organisational issues that get in the way of taking advantage of the technologies. I believe that the absence of a teaching and learning policy and set of practices gets in the way. Because my view is that the technologies enable the the teacher to be alongside and behind the child much more than they're in front of the child, so that there is a greater possibility, it seems to me, of shooting into the mind sideways. And then finally, there's, of course, the poverty of some families and some schools, and we heard enough in the first session to realise that that can be overcome, and that even if it exists, it's not an excuse for not doing something about it, because you can make sure that there's preferential access for poor people in terms of community provisions, etc., etc. So I think there are those barriers. I think I've talked about barriers to progress and how we might overcome them. My point about butterflies is quite simple. It's, you know, the theory is about, of butterfly theory, is that if sufficient butterflies whir their wings in the Amazonian rainforest, a thunderbolt goes across the United States. It's always made me hesitant about visiting the United States. But the point is that there are things with high impact and low effort, and schools are terribly interested in them. So far as I can see, apart from one rather stilted effort that we made in London to produce a book of butterflies of the use of the technologies in learning and teaching, they're small, vivid illustrations that any practitioner can pick up on. I don't think that there's been the generation of that, and in particular, the enablement of people to promote those ideas across the whole thing. And finally, you will all have read, and if we were encouraged to revisit Daniel Goleman this morning about emotional intelligence. Well, that's absolutely right, and he certainly causes a change in thinking. I think Malcolm Gladwell's Tipping Point has been a very pertinent book in terms of the development of the technologies, the overcoming of exclusion, the promotion of inclusion in education. And it requires all sorts of ingredients to get to the tipping point where something becomes unstoppable. If you haven't read the book, you would enjoy it, but it's to do with communicators, experts, etc. In this room, in this gathering, we have all the ingredients of the people who can go away and now know that they are not lonely people pioneering, but they've got ever-growing networks of practice that's going to make more kids have more opportunity to have fulfilled and fulfilling lives. I welcome the technologies. I've often likened it to the sudden availability of the book, and I think it is a good image. Teachers at that point had to stop relying on the spoken word and learn to read, because that's how it was. And I think that's what the technologies do, but the very exciting thing is that the technologies change our view, help change our view of intelligence, and help change our view of the belief that can be translated into practice that every child can walk a step of the way with genius in some respect. Thank you very much.